that seems like, that seems like the trait equalization process only is only talking about characteristics that have moral value. Whereas in this new formulation, it sounds like it's all traits, like not only the ones with moral value, but every trait, including the physical body and the genetics and the species normalization and all that stuff too. Why? I mean, you see what I mean? So it's like, I mean, maybe I need to think more about how to express this, but
Can I ask just a quick question out of curiosity? Is there a reason why people use the label name your trait rather than argument from marginal cases?
Yeah, there's slightly different arguments. Okay, sorry, just one sec. I'll just be right back. I just have a few. Okay, never mind. Actually, it's dealt with. I get it now. Sorry, what was the question? Name the trait and marginal cases. Yeah, they're different arguments. So if you go on like IEP and you look up marginal cases, like you can find Singer's formulation on there. So I do think that they're in the same like general family, like they're trying to do very similar things, but yeah, they're different arguments though.
So what is the difference?
So if you want, I can bring up marginal cases.
I mean, it's a more flexible argument. It has it includes not only marginal cases but other things like species normalization and a lot of other things.
Just let me go to the IEP article so I can just get the actual argument. So here is, let me see if I can get Singer's version. Here's Singer's version. And the general like type of argument, apparently it actually dates back to like Greece with Porphyry. So at least that is my understanding. So that's marginal cases in general. Oh, what? Duplicate text? What the fuck? What was that supposed to mean? It just gave me some weird warning. Does anyone know what that is?
For what? Like in the
yeah, I tried to post, but it gave me some weird like warning.
Where is it?
Just in general main. Look here, I'll try to do it again.
Yeah, try it again.
See, it sends me some weird
screenshots not showing up on mine. Last thing I see.
Oh, yeah, our spam bot is super over the top, and we don't know how to change the settings on it. So I'm working on a second bot until this one. But
well,
yeah,
well
you can
either way,
things in multiple arguments or something like that.
Okay, well, I was going to just show you firsthand, but like either way, you can just find it on the animal ethics entry in IAP. But if you just look, they're different arguments. They have different premises and different conclusions. So like marginal cases is in order to conclude that all and only human beings deserve a full and equal moral status, there must be some property P that all and only human beings have that can ground such a claim. Any P that only human beings have is a property that some human beings lack. Any P that all human beings have is a property that most animals have as well. Therefore, there's no way to defend the claim that all and only human beings deserve a full and equal moral status. So name the trait just has like different premises and a different conclusion.
So what is the name your trait argument?
I can pull that up too. Here, one second. Will it let me post the drive link?
I mean, they might be.
There's a drive link. Oh, okay, cool. Yes, there's a drive link.
Trivially be distinct arguments, and they involve distinct sentences, but there might be a more general sense of sameness of argument, according to which, for example, Descartes' argument and Anselm's argument are the same argument because they're both ontological arguments.
Yeah, well, I mean, it just depends on how you think about sameness, I guess. Like, if some family resemblance thing is going to count for sameness, then you're going to probably be able to say a lot of things are the same. So,
I mean, in the sense that there's a trivial sense of sameness of argument, according to which any given interpretation of an author is going to generate an entirely distinct argument, even if the goal of the interpretation is to give the argument being interpreted. And I take it that that's not what you mean when you say they're different arguments.
Well, I mean, when I say they're different arguments, I just mean that they have different premises and a different conclusion. So if you say, I see some similarity there, therefore they're the same argument, I mean, that's not really how I would, like, use the same. Like, I wouldn't use the same in that way. So, like, do you actually even know what name the trait says, or are you just kind of randomly saying shit?
I'm looking at it now.
Yeah. Right. So it's just a different set of premises and a different conclusion. So name the trait is that if your view affirms a given human is trait equalizable to a given non-human animal while retaining moral value, then your view can only deny the given non-human animal has moral value on pain of contradiction. Your view affirms a given human is trait equalizable to a given non-human animal while retaining moral value. Therefore, your view can only deny the given non-human animal has moral value on pain of contradiction.
What is trait equalizability?
That would just be where you just take all the propositions that are true of one entity and another, and then you just go through kind of like a series of changes where you just switch the things that are true of the one to match the propositions that are true of the other. So yeah, I mean, so you can just notice some obvious differences. So like name the trait doesn't talk about like property P, for example. Like
Wait, hold on.
particularists might have a problem. Pardon me?
Tell me what trait equalizability is again. I'm not quite sure I'm getting it.
Just picture here, I'll just post an image if it lets me post an image. Just picture like a series of possible worlds and just picture like two entities and just picture modifying them as you move through those possible worlds, from having a bunch of different propositions be true of them to having all the same propositions true of them.
And the idea is that you can reduce an entity to a set of traits.
What? You can reduce what?
Reduce an entity to a set of traits.
Well, traits just being like things true of the being in question.
Propositions, I'm sorry. When I say traits, I mean a set of propositions.
Yeah.
Isn't that controversial?
A little bit.
I'm just saying that there's a set of propositions that describe what a being is.
Well, you have to say that a being is entirely describable by propositions. Because if that's not the case, then there could be some humanist that isn't propositional that may grant like moral fecundity.
Well, then you don't have to like. I mean, look, if you're gonna say there's something other than propositions, like trait is just supposed to be like an inclusive term for just the things that are true of the being in question.
I'm having a hard time seeing how it sounded like trait equalizability was just going to be like vacuous because it sounds like it's just a function from objects to objects or something. But you can plug anything into that function. You can plug one thing into that function and get that very same thing as a value. Namely, when all of the propositions that are true of it are also true of it.
So are you pointing out like something that's supposed to be a challenge, or are you just saying that there's something that like weirded you out about?
I'm just trying to understand
I'm not really following.
why this terminology is needed.
Well, I mean, you just kind of, it's just for picturing like what's going on in the argument. Like you just try to picture at what point, right? If you're just swapping, you take something that has value, you take something that doesn't have value, and you just modify the thing that has value towards the thing that doesn't have value. And you're just trying to find the point where the value disappears.
Doesn't that just beg the question that moral value is non-vague?
No, I mean, it doesn't, it could be that you have just some general idea.
How can I construct like a Soriades series with individuals that have certain properties? At one end of the series, the things have value. At the other end of the series, they lack value, and yet there's a range in the middle of which it's neither true nor false that the things in that range have value.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like that's almost inevitably going to be the kind of thing that anyone's going to end up saying, because there's going to be some, like, I mean, picking out like the exact point down to every single proposition that's true of that being. I mean, that seems like a kind of difficult thing to do. So, like, I don't think I have any problem with that.
From what I can tell, the general idea behind this argument is really just marginal cases, but with this additional terminology that's unnecessary.
Well, I mean, I guess that you can think whatever you think, but yeah, they're separate arguments, so they have separate premises and separate conclusions.
Do you think it follows from your characterization of difference of argument that if I write out an argument in English and then you translate it into German, that I've produced a distinct argument?
I think that's a false analogy. Why would you compare it to just stating the same thing in different languages? The arguments are stating something different.
So my question is, why aren't these arguments expressing the same kinds of propositions?
Well, I mean, just take the conclusion, for example. So, marginal cases has a conclusion that says there's no way to defend the claim that all and only human beings deserve a full and equal moral status. You understand that that's distinct from saying your view can only deny the given non-human animal has moral value on pain of contradiction.
Yeah, but I can.
Well, wait, but don't just brush over it. Like that's a distinction.
I think this is really getting trivial. There's a sense of argument according to which I can, for example, give multiple sentences that are logically equivalent and still have the same argument, even though the sentences are distinct. So, for
Right.
example,
Well, I mean, look, let's just take the conclusion. Like let's just go from just a basic proof. The conclusions are different propositions. They don't express the same thing. They're different
right.
propositions.
If I take, for example, a universal generalization, and then have certain rules that convert it into an existential generalization, they're going to be distinct propositions. But arguably, if the two arguments are logically equivalent, then there's like an interesting sense in which they're just the same argument. I could give the very same argument where each of the premises only involves universal generalization.
Right. Look, I'm sorry. I'm getting just a bit caught up here. Like I don't understand why you would say that they're the same argument. They have separate conclusions, they have separate premises. All I hear you saying is just that they're doing something similar. And I'm fine with the claim that they're doing something similar. But I mean, if you're just going to argue that two arguments that have completely distinct components that don't express the same propositions, right? There's separate propositions in there are somehow the same argument, then
Wait, he's saying
you
that
know,
the forms are the same, right? Like you could, they follow the same types of inferences. Like you could replace existential and universal. Well, maybe not in that to that extent, but if he's saying like the forms are the same, he's saying that's like his criteria for sameness.
When you look at Singer's original, when you look at
no, look, I can tell you the gist of what's going to happen though. It's just like you're going to define what you mean by sameness, and if you're broad enough, you're going to be able to say things are the same, and if you're narrow enough, you're going to say that they're not. Now, for me, if two arguments have distinct conclusions, right? If their conclusions are like clearly separate propositions, I wouldn't say that those are like the same thing. That's not what I would say. But if you want to use so what I'm not interested in, let me just kind of end this right now. I'm not interested in discussion about your subjective threshold of sameness, right? Like that's not anything that I care about.
my point is when you go read Singer's original chapter.
I've told you. So yeah, I've told you this. I'm not interested in this. Now, do you actually want to raise?
I'm interested in what you have to say, though. I want to hear more of what you have to say.
Do you actually want to raise some kind of problem? Well, no. Let me be clear. Like I'm just visiting here. So if you want to talk to me, I'm not going to sit here and talk about something I don't have any interest in. So
yeah, but we can't hear what he has to say. We're
right. No. If you guys want to hear what he has to say, I'm happy to leave. Right. But if you have anything else,
sorry.
Yeah, Zach, what were you gonna say?
So when you go and read Singer's original chapter, he doesn't list things out in premise conclusion form. In other words, you can't in any precise fashion point to a sentence and say that's the premise in the argument or a premise in the argument. He writes it in prose, right? And what you see on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a way of formalizing or putting into premise conclusion form the ideas that Singer was advancing. And when you go and read that original chapter, as far as I can tell, you could take the idea that Singer was putting forward and have him end up with a conclusion very similar to the conclusion in the name your trait. For example, the conclusion could be that you can't, on pain of contradiction, think that animals lack moral value because you've already granted that humans have moral value and there's no morally relevant distinction between the two.
So can I attempt to defend name the trait, because I do know the argument and I
But
actually
it's not
disagree with you.
name the trait that's under attack, right? The issue is there an isomorphism, a basic isomorphism between Singer's argument and the name the trait argument, so that they're fundamentally the same argument?
Yeah.
Well, I think what the difference is that, like, the name the trait goes through the same process that the argument for marginal cases outlined, but it only stops at the process. It doesn't continue on to a specific conclusion. Like, there is nothing to say that because you assign humans moral value, that animals would have moral value. Name the trait wouldn't assert that. It would instead just ask you what that trait is. And if you make a distinction, it would accept it. Whereas from argument for marginal cases is an attempt to show why those reasons are bad.
Well, Singer's original conclusion is that what we should say is that some human beings have much moral value, and some animals have significant degree of moral value, and
Sure.
that we should sort of give up the idea that there's like an interesting threshold.
Well, sure. That's what I'm saying constitutes the difference. Is that our argument for marginal cases is attempting to put forward an argument as to why there is a difference and why we should reject them. But when it comes to name the trait, it will accept answers. It will say, hey, if you've made this distinction, such as intelligence, then I accept it as long as you're consistent with it. It doesn't stand to disagree with those sorts of things. It's much more made for any sort of subjectivist, or for any thought that you can just pick whatever you want.
So why doesn't a subjectivist say something like, the only sense in which other humans matter is that I have an emotional connection to them, and seeing to the advancement of their interests is emotionally satisfying to me in various ways. But because I don't have connections to other individuals, including some human beings, advancing their interests isn't necessarily in my own interests.
So what the proponents of name the trait would do is that the original just modus ponens form of it would just accept that. It would be like, okay, that's the difference you named, we accept that. And then what they trend to do is try to take the conversation beyond the original argument and just reductio it, and just ask, well, okay, if you believe that, then these are the sorts of consequences it leads to. And then they'll ask if you accept the consequences. And if you accept the consequences, then it's over. If they don't like the consequences that you accept, then they'll just stop talking to you. And that's about the entire process.
So there can be a point in the debate where there's no convincing the one side?
Yeah. It doesn't attempt to make a convincing argument one way or another. And I think that's the difference with our argument from marginal cases, is it does attempt to make a convincing argument one way.
Well, the argument for marginal cases isn't going to convince like an anti-realist, for example.
No, of course not. But, it's trying to make a point, whereas I feel like name the trait isn't really trying to make a point. It's only looking to see if you're consistent with the things you say, and that's it.
Oh, okay. Wait, did Ask Yourself leave?
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't want to hear you talk, so he left.
You destroyed him, buddy.
What a fucking asshole, honestly.
I just noticed I have the role of leftist punching bag, so that's nice.
No, I mean, there is like a verbal disagreement to be had that isn't particularly interesting, but I think there is also a substantive debate where we talk about the argument, like an author's argument. In fact, we introduce names for them sometimes. We talk about like Anselm's logical argument or Singer's argument for marginal cases. But then if you gather together like 10 different textbooks that summarize the arguments and then write out all of the sentences, they're going to be distinct sentences, right? That's what interpreting an argument involves. So it seems like there has to be like an interesting sense of argument with respect to which writing out different sentences doesn't necessarily result in a new argument. Otherwise, philosophical interpretation would just be impossible.
Yeah, I don't know. It's